All right, I'm back. So this is part two. We've gotten past 3.1 in development. We talked about the themes. We talked about some new research methods that deal with development. And so now we're moving into sort of looking at the change of people across their lifespan in the first section that we talk about, because we're going to be talking about physical and cognitive and social development across the lifespan. So the first one we're going to focus on is the physical development. And we're going to go through different stages of physical development. We're going to talk about the prenatal period, which is before birth, then we'll talk about infancy and childhood, after we've been born physically, and then adolescence, and then adulthood. So that'll be the process in which we talk about physical development, that chronological order that we talked about in the last lecture. All right, so we start at the beginning, prenatal development. A lot of people have been studying the influences of environment on us, and we know about genetics, like, it comes from our parents. And we talk about the environmental factors being things like, what happens around us once we're born. But um, there's also environment inside the womb. And prenatal is a period of time before birth. So it means before you are actually, a living, breathing thing outside of your mom. And your mom's womb is a big time environment for our development. One of the first things we have to, avoid, or a mother who's pregnant has to avoid, is teratogens. And we all know that cigarette smoking and alcohol and drugs, those things are bad, and a pregnant mom can't engage in those activities because those agents can harm the baby. But we call those things teratogens. They're harmful agents, and they can be chemicals or they can be viruses. And if they reach the embryo or fetus during the prenatal development, um, they if they reach it during prenatal development, then they can harm the baby. But there are other things that are teratogens that we're not aware of. Things like caffeine, things like harmful deli meats, things like too much mercury in tuna. Those things can also cause harm as well as over-the-counter medications, and even an illness. So, like COVID could have the problem. Now, COVID's not, you know, we don't have any studies yet of it, but we could have a lot of studies of the long-term impacts that humans have from having their mom having COVID while they were in the womb, or any other virus that the mom might pick up. There's also hormonal factors. There are theories that a male baby can be treated like a virus in the mother's womb and can be exposed to antibodies that have hormones that could change long-term behavior. So there are theories out there about that. And then, of course, the environmental factors. When we talk about famine, or something in which people didn't have a lot of food available to them, then it also is an example of how these things can harm us while we're in the womb of our parents. All right, next is infancy and childhood. So the physical development of us through our infancy period, right after birth, and also some of our sort of childhood development. The first thing we talk about with infancy period in physical development is reflexes, because reflexes, just by nature, are the things that the behaviors that you have that are unlearned, that you had them immediately at birth. And so we look at your behavior right after birth to see if there are any things that you do that obviously were unlearned, right? So we're looking for any indication of behaviors that you implement that you didn't have any experiences to help you learn those behaviors. A lot of those reflexes at birth have to do with survival. And so the reflexes that we've sort of identified, one is the rooting reflex. This is where an infant's touched on the cheek. They will actually turn their head towards where they were touched, believing it's their mother's breast and looking to feed. And like, if you're looking at a rooting reflex from another animal, another example would be like a puppy or a kitten, because they don't have the physical development to see yet. Their eyes aren't developed enough. And so when they're touched, they turn to where they're touched because they're seeking the nourishment from their mother, and they don't have the eyesight to do it. But humans also exhibit this reflex. So this rooting reflex is super important in psychology. There's also the grasping reflex, right? I'm trying to get my hands in the camera. The grasping reflex, when a baby feels like it's dropping, it has like a monkey strong grip. And then they're sucking, so obviously to be able to feed. And then the startle reflex, when their hands go up in the air and they're startled, right? These reflexes are all an indication to us that human is on track, that baby is on track in their physical and psychological development. There's no issues. Like if we don't see these reflexes and we know that humans have them, then we're worried about the physical and cognitive development. Like startling, like being scared at something should be a cognitive instinct that they have. And if they don't have it, then we're worried about what that sort of cognitive processing is. Also with the physical development of the rooting, grasping, and all the other things, sucking, those things tell us if they're physically on track like they should be. And so that's super important. Okay, so the next thing is motor development. So we're talking about sort of these skills like gross motor and fine motor skills. This is more childhood physical development. Gross motor skills is going to be your large muscles. Fine motor skills, a little bit harder skills with smaller muscles like picking up a fork or writing with a crayon, right? Gross motor skills could be something like standing, walking, running. And so these things happen in a universal order. They all, like a gross motor skill, like before you're able to run, you're going to have to be able to sit up, you have to be able to lift your head up, you're going to have to be able to crawl, then you'll have to stand, and then you walk and then run. So that order will always stay the same. You always do them in that process. But where it changes is the variation in the timing. Some people might develop the walking and gone through all the process to walking up to 10 months, and some people it might give them all the process to like 12 or even longer, up to 18 months, right? But at least we know that the universal order is the same, so we can track the order, the process, but the timing could be a little bit different. Same with fine motor skills. We all talk about this motor development, this physical development is a type of maturation. And I just want to focus that maturation is the biological growth that happens in us that is pretty much not influenced by our environment. So how tall we're going to be, how bald we are, those things are going to happen through maturation time. And a lot of this gross motor, fine motor skills, those things happen through maturation, that even in a isolated moment that they wouldn't be that they would still develop. The next sort of the next sort of development physically actually is dealing with cognition as well. So the physical ability, the brain's wiring to be able to process certain cognitive abilities. And in this one, we're talking about depth perception. And that's the ability for them to see distance and in 3D. And we already talked about depth perception in the perception unit, so you should know about that and some of the visual cues that we use. But the visual cliff was a study that they did with infants, right, young children below the age of 1, to see when they develop depth perception or if they have that ability. And the idea is that there's a table with a pattern on it, and then halfway across the table that's raised up in the ground, there's it changes from pattern to clear glass. And then below the glass, down below, deep on the bottom floor, is another pattern that matches the one on the table. And so the idea is, if the baby doesn't have depth perception, if you put their mother on the other side of the table, that they would crawl all the way across the table to their mother. And so they tried this, and it turned out babies from 6 months to 14 months, most babies refused to cross over where the pattern stopped and the clear glass became. And what we realized is that babies at around 6 months develop depth perception, and they realize that there's distance, right? That they are in danger of falling if they continue to cross that table. And you can think of a visual cliff as the same as like steps. Steps have the same pattern, but does the baby recognize that the pattern goes down and not flat across? Whether or not they can manage the steps themselves, or they need to be guided on steps. Okay, when we talk about physical development, we also have to talk about critical versus sensitive periods, and you see them plotted out right here on the graph. The sensitivity period is like when it's really important time, your brain is ready to sort of to achieve or understand or comprehend something, or acquire a certain skill. And the critical period is like a window in which, if you don't get experience in that it could lead to you never having that ability. It could lead to irreversible change, right? If you either do get something or don't get something in this critical period, it could lead to irreversible change. So when you look at the chart, language is a very good one. You notice that it turns out that language has a very language and seeing and hearing and sensory information. They have a real tight critical period, a real tight window at early birth, all the way up to about maybe age 8. It turns out that if you're not exposed to a language before age 8, you may never be able to comprehend the grammar perfectly. You can get the vocab, but maybe not the grammar. And so that shows us that this critical period up until 8 is a window that closes, right? The sensitivity means that right during that window, we are very ready to acquire language. So you see that the chart shows that during that period of time, there's a very high sort of sensitivity toward language and sensory acquisition right during our infancy, and then it starts to fade away, and then that critical window starts to close, right? So sensitive periods when our brain's ready to sort of respond to a particular experience, the critical period is this short window, right? And imprinting is another example. It's when an animal uh, so it is more like social because it's an attachment that's made, but it is made in a critical period, in an immediate attachment. And it leads to the physical mimicking for certain animals during their early life. So an example is this Conrad Lawrence, who's pictured here. He took these geese away from their mother, so when they hatched, all they saw was him. And because the geese are mobile and in a world and environment that's filled with danger, they're not in a nest or are protected or are staying in one place. They have to immediately attach. They have to immediately connect to their provider, their guardian, their parent. Well, Conrad took away the parent, so what did the geese do? They immediately attached to the closest physical thing that could be their parent. And so everywhere Conrad Lawrence walked, they walked right behind him. When he swam, they swam behind him. It was their physical development was really crucial to their survival, right? But it was also had to happen in a critical period, an immediate window. And so that's why they're immediately attached to him and started to mimic. Okay, so that leads us to the awkward period of physical development, adolescence, which is so much fun to talk about. Okay, so that leads us to the adolescence period. So the milestones that we're talking about have a lot to do physically with puberty. Yes, there are growth spurts where we can grow up to 6 inches in a year and eat a lot of food to try to keep up with that, so you feel like these hungries. But the big one is puberty, the milestone, and that's when we're able to physically able to reproduce. It's marked by menarche and spermarchy. Menarche is when the female has her first period, so she's able now to physically able to reproduce, and spermarchy would be for the male, their first ejaculation, so obviously able to reproduce. That also leads us to primary versus secondary sex characteristics that are developing through puberty. Testes and ovaries would be primary because they are specifically responsible for our reproduction. So their development into being able to reproduce is that sort of marked the primary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics, though, are the ones that come as well with the physical development of puberty, but not responsible for reproduction. So female breast development, pubic hair, things like that, underarm hair, things like that, are secondary sex characteristics that come with the physical development of puberty. All right, so the last one is adulthood, and adulthood is pretty easy to understand. It is going to be a constant sort of decline, right? So, unfortunately for me, it hits home. As a 48-year-old, I see this, and by the way, this steady decline speeds up as we get into our late adulthood ages, so 70s and 80s. All of this stuff is going to start really speeding up in its decline. For females, reproductive ability, menopause, they're no longer producing eggs and no longer allowed to reproduce. Our mobility is going to decrease, our flexibility, our reaction time. When we talk about fluid intelligence declining, right, during this period of time, our reaction time and speed of processing things goes down. Our senses, our vision and our hearing are all declining during adulthood. And so this will be the steady physical theme until, unfortunately, we pass away. All right, so that was the second set. That was physical development, right? So next thing we're moving into is going to be, and let me check to make sure it's not, oh, great. We have to talk about cognitive development next. All right, see ya.